This is a reading from the Good News according to Matthew. Peter came and said to Jesus, "Lord, a brother or sister sins against me. How often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, I tell you, but 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience on me, and I will pay you everything.' The lord of that slave released him and forgave him his debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' And his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he could pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then the Lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked man, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you?' And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." The Gospel of the Lord. This Gospel is about the forgiver and the forgiven. The one who forgives and the one who's forgiven. 2 stories interlaced. This is not just one aspect of, how to be a well-rounded person. Forgiveness is not just another Christian virtue, if you like to say. I think forgiveness was expressed in the very birth of the Christian movement. Remember that day when those beaten apostles who had abandoned Jesus on Calvary huddled in a room? They were terrified. They were dispirited. They felt enormous guilt. And Jesus appeared to them and simply said, "Peace be with you." It was a magnificent, dramatic example of this forgiveness that we're talking about today. But I think it was the energy behind that actually gave the apostles the momentum, the whole sense of preaching the gospel that they engaged in the following few years. So the point I'm making is, forgiveness is not just one of the things. It really goes to the very heart of the gospel and perhaps our own search for what we mean by the Christian life. Let me tell you a story. Back in 2008, 12 years ago in Sydney, a young man was involved in a fight with another young man who was Samoan. This Australian-born, was fighting this young Samoan, and he killed him. He killed him in what was later described a terrible and tragic accident. But the story really focuses upon a scene inside a King Street court, a court of law, following the accidental death verdict that was given to the man who struck the blow. And the story is about the family of that young dead Samoan. During the court case, they embraced the young accused rugby league player in an astonishing expression of forgiveness. During the case, they prayed for him, prayed for the court, prayed for the police, prayed for the legal teams, and prayed for this man who had killed their son. One of the female members of the dead man's family kissed the assailant and said, "You will always be in my prayers." It's almost a breathless story, isn't it? Yes, it was an accidental killing, but nevertheless, this family had lost their son, and they still were able to direct their, well, what was it? Understanding, compassion, sense of trying to stand in that man's shoes. They could still do that with the man who was accused and found guilty of, well, it was accidental death. A Sydney detective, a hard-bitten policeman who investigated the matter throughout, said of the Samoan family, "They're simply the nicest family I've ever encountered. A deeply religious and loving family who heard the evidence and prayed constantly throughout the trial, not only for the defendant, but for his family, and as I said, for the judge, for the jury, for the legal counsels, and for the police." That policeman said, "I've never seen anything like this in my career as a police officer. The ability of these people to accept and forgive." Before leaving the court, the family joined hands in a room and held a collective prayer for the young man who had accidentally killed their son. How is such forgiveness possible? I just really can't imagine myself growing to the level of being able to behave in that manner. It almost defies belief given our proclivity for revenge, which is deeply embedded in each one of us. How often do we plead for forgiveness? Not simply some soft attitude that we need to practice from time to time, but real forgiveness. Let me talk about 3 little examples of our need for forgiveness that have occurred in the last few years. Firstly, the church really making statements about the need to be forgiven for the extraordinary acts of sexual abuse that's happened in our community. Our bruised, tempest-tossed church asking for forgiveness for the sexual abuse of children. Pope Francis has, there's been a number of statements of expression of sorrow. Pope Francis, in one moment, spoke about the shame and sorrow that this brings us, and promised to, in these words, to root out this tragic horror. So forgiveness is not something outside us, it's something that we are aching to search for. Another recent example, or fairly recent, was when the National Parliament reached out to the Indigenous community and asked to be forgiven for the attitudes and the history of dispossession that's happened in Australia. And particularly to those of the stolen generation. Kevin Rudd joined with the leader of the opposition and they moved out to members of the stolen generation and simply said they were sorry. An interesting thing that was less reported was, is everything okay? Everything all right? Good. A little part of that story that has been less reported was that one of the Indigenous people, Lorraine Peters, presented to the National Parliament a coulomin containing a message of thanks. So here you've got the forgiveness, the forgiver and the forgiven coming together in that very dramatic moment in Australian history. I suppose there's so many examples of really, asking to be, looking for the ability to say sorry. They're speckled to our personal lives and the lives of our country. Probably the most recent one, of course, was that tragic situation in May this year when a mining company was engaged in the destruction of an irreplaceable sacred site at Yukon Gorge, a site in which there was evidence of Indigenous occupation which was 46,000 years old. The company is trying to find a way of expressing their sorrow. So the point I'm making is this simple idea of the forgiver and the forgiven, this nature of forgiveness, really is interlaced into so many parts of our personal and national life. Forgiveness is one of the defining qualities of who we are as Christians, as Catholics. And when we come to really face it, nothing is harder. It's all very well to talk about forgiveness in the abstract when we're feeling well and confident, but it's an entirely different matter when you have felt abused and deeply hurt. There's even a more fundamental thing to reflect upon in the light of this gospel, and that is the need that we have to forgive ourselves. The need we have to be gentle and to understand that we are living our life in the embrace of a gentle and gracious God who is saying to each one of us, you are precious, you are honoured, and you are loved. This is the theme, the stream that goes right to the very foundation of what it means to believe as Christians. Let me just conclude with one final example of this, and I turn to Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. When apartheid was lifted and the nation was trying to come together under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, they decided to have what they called truth and reconciliation processes. And they believed that forgiveness begins with listening to stories of the perpetrator and those who have been abused. And they have shone a light on the power of this forgiveness as a result of this. And Archbishop Tutu says this: forgiveness does not mean condoning what has been done. It means taking what happened seriously and not minimising it. Drawing out the sting in the memory that threatens to poison our entire existence. And that's what the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa was continuing to try to make possible. And it has a great light to shine upon us as we reflect upon this whole sense of forgiveness in our lives, in the life of our nation, and in our search for faith. Forgiveness started our church. It gave energy to those first apostles, as I said. It continues to be the fuel upon which we need to face our future in the sort of passionate ability we have to reform and rebuild this tempest-tossed church.